Tonight we will explore the extraordinary world of the Odyssey, one of the oldest and most enduring stories in the history of human civilization. As you relax and unwind, you will hear 100 fascinating facts about the poem itself, the journey it describes, the art and archaeology it has inspired, and the remarkable way a story told more than 2,000 years ago continues to shape the way human beings think about home, adventure, loss, and the long road back to where they belong. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the world of the Odyssey gently guide you towards sleep. The Odyssey is an ancient Greek epic poem that tells the story of Odysseus, king of the island of Ithaca, and his 10-year journey home following the end of the Trojan War, a voyage that takes him through a world of gods, monsters, enchantresses, and the dead before he finally reaches the shores of the island he has been struggling to return to for the better part of 2 decades. The poem is composed of 24 books and approximately 12,100 lines of verse, making it roughly half the length of the Iliad, the companion epic that tells the story of the war itself, and it is organized around a central narrative of homecoming that has become one of the most fundamental story structures in the literature of the Western world. The word Odyssey has passed into common usage in dozens of languages as a synonym for any long and eventful journey, which is perhaps the most concrete measure of how deeply the poem has embedded itself in the way human beings think and speak about their experience of moving through the world. The Odyssey is attributed by ancient tradition to Homer, a poet about whom almost nothing is known with certainty, and whose very existence as a historical individual has been debated by scholars for more than 2 centuries in a controversy known as the Homeric question that has generated more scholarly literature than almost any other problem in the history of classical studies. The ancient Greeks themselves disagreed about where Homer was born 7 cities, including Smyrna, Chios, Colophon, Salamis, Rhodes, Argos, and Athens. Each claimed the honor and the biographical traditions that accumulated around his name during antiquity are almost entirely legendary rather than historical in character. What is clear from internal evidence in the poems themselves is that they were composed in an ancient Greek dialect that combines elements from different regional traditions in a way that suggests the poems were designed to be understood across the Greek-speaking world rather than in any single locality. The question of whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by the same person, by different poets, or by a long tradition of oral poets whose accumulated contributions were eventually written down and attributed to a single name, has been one of the most productive and most contentious debates in the history of literary scholarship, and one that has significantly shaped the understanding of how oral literature works and how written texts emerge from oral literature traditions. The scholarly position known as analyst criticism, which was dominant in the 19th and early 20th centuries, argued that the poems showed evidence of multiple authorship, and that the single name of Homer was a later attribution applied to what were originally separate and diverse traditions. The opposing position, known as Unitarian criticism, argued for the essential unity of each poem and the presence of a single organizing intelligence behind it. The development of oral formulaic theory in the 20th century provided a new framework that largely superseded both positions. The American classicist Milman Parry, working in the 1920s and 30s, developed the theory of oral formulaic composition that transformed the understanding of how the Homeric poems were created and transmitted, demonstrating through his study of living oral epic traditions in Yugoslavia that the characteristic features of Homeric style, its repeated phrases, its stock epithets, its formulaic descriptions of repeated actions were not signs of poor craftsmanship or multiple authorship, but the natural features of a sophisticated oral poetic tradition in which poets composed in performance using a repertoire. of memorized formulas that could be combined and adapted in response to the specific demands of each performance. Parry's fieldwork in Yugoslavia, conducted with his student Albert Lord, provided a living model of oral epic composition that allowed scholars to understand how poems of the length and complexity of the Iliad and the Odyssey could be composed and transmitted without writing, and the theory he developed subsequently, refined and extended by Lord and by generations of subsequent scholars, remains the foundation of modern Homeric scholarship and one of the most significant contributions to the 19a. Understanding of oral literature made in any period. The Odyssey was almost certainly composed in the 8th century before the Common Era, though the precise date of its composition is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, and the range of dates proposed by different scholars extends from the 9th to the 6th century, with most current opinion favouring a date somewhere in the second half of the 8th century, roughly contemporary with, or slightly later than, the Iliad. The poems were composed in a period of significant cultural change in the Greek world. The period that historians call the Greek Dark Ages was ending. The city-states were developing, the alphabet was being adopted from the Phoenicians, and the cultural and political institutions that would define classical Greek civilization were taking shape, and the values and social structures depicted in the poems reflect a world that was already somewhat archaic, even at the time of their composition, looking back to a heroic age that the Greeks of the 8th century understood as their distant past. The stories that the Odyssey tells were not invented by its poet, but drawn from a much larger body of mythological tradition about the Trojan War and its aftermath that circulated in ancient Greece in both oral and eventually written form, and the specific choices made by the Odyssey's composer about which episodes to include, which to omit, and how to organize the narrative reflect a creative intelligence working within and against an existing tradition rather than inventing from scratch. Several other poems dealing with the aftermath of the Trojan War are known to have existed in antiquity, collectively called the epic cycle, of which only fragments survive. And the comparison between what these fragments tell us about the broader tradition and what the Odyssey actually does with the same material gives some indication of the specific artistic choices that distinguish the Odyssey from the larger tradition from which it drew. The poem's organization of its narrative, its selection of episodes, and its treatment of the central character all reflect decisions that were deliberate and consequential rather than simply traditional. The Odyssey begins not with Odysseus himself, but with his son Telemachus, a young man who has grown up without his father and who is struggling to assert his authority in a household overrun by the suitors competing for his mother Penelope's hand. And the first 4 books of the poem, known to scholars as the Telemachy, follow Telemachus as he travels to the mainland Greek kingdoms of Pylos and Sparta in search of news of his father. The decision to begin the poem with Telemachus rather than with Odysseus is one of the most celebrated compositional choices in the history of literature, and it has been discussed extensively by scholars as a means of establishing the situation at Ithaca before Odysseus arrives to resolve it, of introducing the theme of the father-son relationship that runs through the poem's final books, and of demonstrating the narrative sophistication of a poet who was capable of organizing a complex, multi-stranded story with considerable structural intelligence. The goddess Athena, whose relationship with Odysseus is one of the central relationships of the poem, functions in the Odyssey not simply as a divine helper who assists her favorite mortal, but as a fully developed character whose interventions in the human action of the poem reflect a specific and consistent set of values her: admiration for intelligence, cleverness, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances that make her the divine embodiment of the qualities that Odysseus himself most characteristically displays. She appears in the poem in a range of disguises and in her own divine form, advising Telemachus, helping Odysseus, and in the poem's final books, descending to Ithaca to oversee the resolution of the conflict with the suitors, and her consistent presence throughout the narrative gives the poem a divine perspective on the human action that connects the individual story of Odysseus's homecoming to the larger framework of divine order and justice within which the poem understands all human experience to be embedded. The Cyclops episode in the 9th book of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his men are trapped in the cave of the one-eyed giant Polyphemus, and Odysseus engineers their escape by blinding the Cyclops and hiding his men under the bellies of the giant's sheep, is one of the most celebrated episodes in ancient literature, and one that demonstrates several of the qualities that define Odysseus as a hero: his intelligence, his resourcefulness, his willingness to use deception, and his sometimes fatal tendency toward pride and self-assertion. The episode also introduces the curse that drives much of the poem's subsequent action. Polyphemus is the son of the sea god Poseidon, and the blinding of his son gives Poseidon a personal grievance against Odysseus that results in the god using his power over the seas to delay and complicate Odysseus's homecoming for the entire duration of the poem. The relationship between Odysseus's cleverness and the suffering it causes him is one of the central tensions of the poem's understanding of the heroic character. The sirens, the enchanting figures whose irresistible song lures sailors to their death, appear in the 12th book of the Odyssey in one of the most celebrated episodes of the poem, and one that has generated one of the richest traditions of artistic and literary response in the history of Western culture, inspiring paintings, sculptures, poems, operas, films, and philosophical meditations on the relationship between beauty, desire, and destruction across more than 2,000 years of cultural history. Odysseus's solution to the danger of the sirens stopping his men's ears with wax and having himself tied to the mast so that he can hear the song without being able to act on its compulsion is one of the most celebrated examples of his characteristic approach to danger, using intelligence and foresight to transform an apparently impossible situation into one he can survive and even turn to his advantage. The episode has been read as an allegory of the relationship between the artist and the dangerous beauty of art that can overwhelm the person who seeks it without adequate preparation. The island of Circe, where Odysseus and his men spend a year with the enchantress, who transforms his crew into pigs before being persuaded by Odysseus, with the help of the god Hermes, to restore them to human form, is one of the most elaborately described locations in the poem, and the site of one of the most psychologically complex episodes in Odysseus's long journey. Circe occupies a position in the poem's geography that is both literally and symbolically between the known world and the land of the dead that Odysseus must visit before he can continue his journey home, and her island is characterized by a quality of enchanted timelessness that makes it both appealing and dangerous, a place where the desire to remain and forget the goal of homecoming is as great a threat as any of the poem's more obviously violent dangers. The relationship between Odysseus and Circe, which develops from conflict into something closer to mutual respect and even affection, is one of the more nuanced human relationships in the poem. The catabasis, the descent to the underworld that Odysseus undertakes in the 11th book of the Odyssey, in which he travels to the land of the dead to consult the shade of the prophet Tiresias about how to complete his homecoming, is one of the most significant episodes in the poem and one of the most influential passages in the history of Western literature, providing a model for subsequent literary descents to the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Inferno, and numerous later works. During his time among the dead, Odysseus encounters not only Tiresias but also the shade of his dead mother, whom he did not know had died, and the shade of the great hero Achilles, whose famous statement that he would rather be the lowest living labourer on earth than king among the dead has been discussed by scholars as one of the poem's most direct statements about the value of life and the inadequacy of the power now. Heroic ideal of glory as a compensation for the loss of ordinary human experience. Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who waits for him in Ithaca for 20 years while fending off the suitors who are consuming her household and competing for her hand, is one of the most complex and most carefully drawn female characters in ancient literature, and one whose intelligence, resourcefulness, and emotional depth give her a claim to be considered as much a hero of the poem as Odysseus himself. Her famous stratagem of weaving and unweaving the funeral shroud she is making for her father-in-law Laertes, working on it by day and undoing her work at night to delay the moment when she must choose among the suitors, is one of the most celebrated examples of female intelligence and resistance in the literary tradition, and her management of a household under siege for 20 years, with no guarantee that her husband will ever return, reflects a form of heroism that the poem values alongside the more conventionally martial heroism of the male. Characters. The poem's treatment of time is one of its most sophisticated and most discussed formal features, encompassing not only the 10 years of Odysseus' journey, but the 20 years of his total absence from Ithaca, 10 years of the Trojan War, and 10 years of the subsequent voyage, and organizing these different temporal scales in a narrative structure of considerable complexity that moves between the present of Odysseus' journey and the past of the war through a series of retrospective narratives that Odysseus tells to the various people encounters on his way home. The device of having Odysseus tell his own story to the Phaeacians in books 9 through 12, the section of the poem that contains the most famous adventures, including the Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, and the Underworld, means that the poem's most celebrated episodes are presented not as direct narrative, but as retrospective first-person account, a compositional decision that gives them a quality of subjective remembered experience rather than objective narrated event that contributes significantly to their particular emotional character. The Phaeacians, the mythical seafaring people on whose island of Scheria Odysseus arrives after his escape from the island of the nymph Calypso, occupy a distinctive position in the poem's geography and its thematic structure, existing at a boundary between the world of ordinary human experience and the more fantastical world of the poem's earlier adventures, that is reflected in both their physical location at the edge of the known world, their function in the narrative as the people who will finally transport Odysseus home. Their king Alcinous and queen Arete receive Odysseus with the exemplary hospitality that the poem consistently presents as one of the fundamental obligations of human civilization, and it is in response to their generous reception that Odysseus tells the story of his adventures, giving the narrative of books 9 through 12 its specific character as a performance for an audience of appreciative listeners rather than a simple third-person account of events. The role of xenia, the Greek concept of guest friendship, the obligation to receive and treat strangers with hospitality and generosity in the Odyssey, is so central and so consistently emphasized throughout the poem that many scholars have read it as one of the poem's primary thematic concerns. Using the repeated testing of the hospitality convention across the poem's various episodes to explore the values and the social bonds that hold human civilization together against the forces of disorder and violence that the suitors in Ithaca most completely represent. The suitors' violation of the hospitality norms their consumption of Odysseus' household, their disrespect for Penelope, their plots against Telemachus is the moral basis for the violence with which Odysseus ultimately destroys them, and the poem carefully establishes the suitors' guilt in terms of their violation of xenia before presenting their killing as an act of justified retribution rather than simple revenge. The ancient Greeks organized their knowledge of the mythological tradition associated with Troy and its aftermath into a sequence of poems known collectively as the epic cycle, of which the Iliad and the Odyssey were the most celebrated, but not the only members, and the existence of this larger tradition gives context to the specific choices made by the Odyssey's composer about what to include in the poem and what to leave out or refer to only obliquely. The Nostoi that Returns was a poem dealing with the homecomings of other Greek heroes from Troy, most of which ended badly, and its existence as a parallel text to the Odyssey gives the story of Odysseus's successful homecoming a significance it would not have without that context. His return is not simply a personal achievement, but a contrast with the failed or disastrous returns of his fellow warriors, a distinction that the poem attributes to his intelligence and his relationship with Athena rather than to simple luck. The Bow of Odysseus, which plays a crucial role in the poem's climax, when Odysseus alone, among all the men present in Ithaca, is able to string it and shoot an arrow through the line of 12 axe heads set up by Penelope as the test for her suitors, is one of the most carefully prepared and most symbolically resonant objects in the poem, introduced and described in detail long before the scene of its use, in a way that gives the object a quality of narrative anticipation, unusual even by the standards of a poem that consistently prepares its major climactic moments with great care. The contest of the bow, which Penelope announces as the means by which she will choose among the suitors, is at once a practical test of physical strength and skill, a symbolic assertion of Odysseus's unique identity and authority in his own household, and the mechanism through which the poem moves from the long period of waiting and disguise to the decisive action of the suitor's destruction that the narrative has been building toward since its opening books. The recognition scenes that punctuate the final books of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus, still in the disguise of a beggar, is recognized by his faithful dog Argos, by his old nurse Eurycleia, who recognizes the scar on his leg, and eventually by Penelope herself, are among the most emotionally powerful passages in ancient literature and episodes that have been discussed extensively by scholars as examples of the poem's sophisticated manipulation of the time, audiences' emotional investment in the story and its characters. The recognition of Odysseus by his old dog Argos, who has been waiting for his master's return for 20 years and who dies immediately after seeing him, is one of the most celebrated and most discussed passages in ancient literature, combining the joy of recognition with the pathos of the animal's death in a way that has moved readers across more than 2 millennia, with a directness and an economy that the most elaborate literary effects cannot always achieve. The ending of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus reveals himself to the suitors, kills them with the help of Telemachus and 2 loyal servants, is reunited with Penelope, and then faces the anger of the suitors' families before Athena intervenes to establish a final peace, has been discussed by ancient and modern scholars alike as one of the most dramatically and morally complex conclusions in the history of epic poetry, raising questions about the justice of the mass killing of the suitors and the sustainability of the peace that follows it, that the poem itself does not fully resolve. Some ancient scholars believed that the poem's original ending came earlier at the moment of Odysseus and Penelope's reunion, and that the subsequent episodes involving the suitors' families were later additions, a view that has not been accepted by most modern scholarship, but that reflects a genuine uncertainty about where the poem's emotional and narrative logic most naturally reaches its conclusion. The ancient Greek text of the Odyssey that we read today is the product of a long and complex process of transmission that involved the oral tradition of performance, the initial transcription of the text into writing, the activities of Alexandrian scholars who edited and commented on the poems in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, and the subsequent copying of manuscripts across more than 1,000 years of medieval transmission before the invention of printing, made the text available in the form that modern readers encounter. The Alexandrian scholars working in the Great Library of Alexandria, particularly Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace established the text of the Homeric poems through a process of critical comparison of different manuscript versions, identifying and marking lines they considered spurious, and establishing what they believed to be the authentic text of the poems in a form that became the basis for all subsequent transmission. Their editorial decisions, made more than 2,000 years ago, still shape the text that modern readers encounter in translations of the poem. The geographical world of the Odyssey, which encompasses the known Mediterranean world of early Greece, alongside a series of fantastical locations that exist beyond the boundaries of the known world, has been the subject of sustained, scholarly, and popular attempts to identify the specific, real-world locations that correspond to the poem's described geography, with proposals ranging from the relatively plausible identifying the island of the Cyclopes with Sicily, the land of the dead with locations in southern Italy, to the highly speculative, the ancient Greeks themselves attempted to locate the sites of Odysseus's adventures, and the Roman writer Strabo criticized these attempts as misguided, arguing that the poem's geography was deliberately fantastical, and that seeking real-world equivalents for locations like the island of Circe or the land of the Phaeacians was a category error that misunderstood the nature of epic poetry. The debate about the poem's geography has never been fully resolved and continues to generate popular books and documentary films that propose new identifications of the poem's locations. The Odyssey has been translated into English more times than almost any other work of ancient literature, and the history of its English translations, from George Chapman's version of the early 17th century that inspired Keats's famous sonnet, through Alexander Pope's celebrated verse translation of the early 18th century, to the numerous prose and verse translations of the 20th and 21st centuries, provides a remarkable record of how different literary periods and different translators have understood and responded to the poem's specific qualities of language, tone, and narrative voice. Each translation is inevitably a reflection of its own period as much as of the original poem, making choices about register, diction, and verse form that reflect the literary conventions and cultural assumptions of its time, rather than simply the qualities of the Greek original. And the comparison between different translations of the same passage gives a vivid demonstration of the degree to which any translation is also an interpretation and a creative act in its own right. The influence of the Odyssey on the development of the novel as a literary form has been traced by scholars through a tradition of works that adapt, respond to, or directly imitate the poem's narrative structures and thematic concerns, from the ancient Greek novels of the 2nd century of the Common Era, through the European novel tradition of the 17th and 18th centuries to the 20th century, works most famously James Joyce's Ulysses, that have made the relationship between modern narrative fiction and the Homeric poems one of the most richly productive intertextual relationships in the history of literature. Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, uses the structure of the Odyssey as a framework for a single day in the life of a Dublin advertising canvasser named Leopold Bloom, whose wanderings through the city on the 16th of June 1904 are organised according to a detailed correspondence with the episodes and characters of the Homeric poem that Joyce worked out with great care, and that has been the subject of extensive scholarly commentary and annotation in the century since the novel's publication. The character of Odysseus himself, whose name in Latin becomes Ulysses, and under which name he appears in the Roman and later Western literary tradition, is one of the most complex and most morally ambiguous heroes in ancient literature, combining qualities that the Greek heroic tradition valued highly: courage, intelligence, resourcefulness, endurance, with qualities that the same tradition regarded with suspicion, cunning, deception, the willingness to use words as weapons in a way that has generated sustained debate about whether the poem presents him as an admirable figure, a problematic one, or something more complicated than either characterization allows. The ambivalence toward Odysseus that runs through the ancient tradition. He is admired by some characters and texts and condemned by others, including the tragic poets who frequently portrayed him as a cynical manipulator, reflects a genuine tension within Greek culture about the relationship between intelligence and virtue, between the practical effectiveness of cunning and the moral clarity of straightforward heroism that the Odyssey explores with considerable sophistication without entirely resolving. The island of Calypso, where Odysseus spends 7 years as the unwilling consort of the nymph who has fallen in love with him and who offers him immortality if he will remain with her, is one of the most philosophically resonant locations in the poem, and the site of one of its most direct statements about the nature of human identity and the relationship between mortality and meaning. Odysseus's refusal of Calypso's offer of immortality, his insistence on returning to his mortal wife and his mortal home, even at the cost of eternal life, has been read by scholars as one of the poem's most fundamental statements about the human condition, asserting the value of ordinary human life with its limitations, its losses, and its mortality over the timeless but empty existence that immortality without human connection would involve. The episode establishes at the very beginning of the poem the central value that drives the entire narrative, the conviction that home, however imperfect, is worth any sacrifice to reach. The Scylla and Charybdis episode, in which Odysseus must navigate his ship through a narrow strait between a 6-headed monster that will devour 6 of his men and a whirlpool that will destroy the entire ship if he passes too close, is one of the most dramatic and most formally concentrated of the poem's adventure episodes, and one that has contributed two of the most durable metaphors in Western languages. The idea of being caught between Scylla, Charybdis, as an image of choosing between 2 equally terrible alternatives, has been in continuous use in European languages for more than 2,000 years. Odysseus's decision to pass closer to Scylla and sacrifice 6 men rather than risk the entire ship to Charybdis is one of the most morally complex choices he makes in the entire poem, and his knowledge in advance that 6 specific men will die as a result of the course he has chosen gives the episode a dimension of tragic foreknowledge that distinguishes it from the more purely reactive responses to danger that characterize other episodes in his journey. The cattle of the sun god Helios, which Odysseus' surviving men slaughter and eat on the island of Thrinacia, despite his explicit warnings and his knowledge that Tiresias has told him this act will result in the destruction of the entire remaining crew, is one of the most carefully prepared and most thematically significant episodes in the poem, representing the culmination of the pattern of failed obedience and self-destructive behavior that has characterized the crew's actions throughout the voyage, and that has resulted in the progressive reduction of Odysseus's companions from the full complement of ships and men who left Troy to the single survivor who eventually reaches Ithaca. The killing of the cattle, which the men justify to themselves by their hunger and their desperation after being trapped on the island by adverse winds for a month, is presented by the poem as a genuine transgression against the divine order that cannot be excused by circumstance, and the swift destruction of the entire crew by Zeus following their departure from the island closes the narrative of the companions in a way that leaves Odysseus truly alone for the first time in the poem. The figure of Tiresias, the blind Theban prophet whose shade Odysseus consults in the underworld, appears throughout ancient Greek literature as the archetypal figure of prophetic wisdom, a man whose physical blindness is compensated by an inner sight that allows him to see what others cannot, and his brief appearance in the Odyssey in which he tells Odysseus the conditions he must meet to complete his homecoming and describes his future death, is one of the most concentrated expressions of this figure's significance in the ancient literary tradition. The prophecy Tiresias gives Odysseus about his eventual death, that he will die far from the sea, in a prosperous old age, among a happy people, has been discussed by scholars as a deliberately paradoxical conclusion to a story about a man who has spent 10 years at sea, suggesting that the completion of the homecoming involves not simply a return to Ithaca, but a final transcendence of the sea-wandering identity that the voyage itself has created. The ancient Greek vase paintings that depict scenes from the Odyssey, produced across several centuries, beginning in the 7th century before the Common Era and continuing through the Hellenistic period, constitute one of the most extensive bodies of visual art inspired by a single literary work in the history of Western culture, and provide invaluable evidence about how ancient artists understood and visualized the poem's characters. And episodes. Among the most frequently depicted scenes are the blinding of the Cyclops Polyphemus, the encounter with the Sirens, the transformation of Odysseus's men by Circe, and the killing of the suitors, and the comparison between the visual representations of these scenes on different vases and across different periods gives a picture of the range of interpretations that ancient artists brought to the same literary material and the degree to which the visual tradition developed its own conventions for representing specific episodes that were not always consistent with the poem's descriptions. The Homeric poems played a central role in ancient Greek education, serving as the primary texts through which Greek children learned to read, and through which the values and cultural assumptions of Greek civilization were transmitted from generation to generation, a function that gave them a status in ancient Greek culture comparable to that of sacred scripture in other traditions, and that ensured their continuous copying, performance, and commentary across the entire span of ancient Greek and Roman civilization. The poems were recited at the great Panathenaic festival in Athens, where rhapsodes, professional performers of epic poetry, competed in the recitation of Homeric texts in a formal competition whose rules stipulated that the Iliad and the Odyssey must be performed in their entirety and in the correct sequence, a requirement that both preserved the integrity of the texts and ensured that the full poems, rather than selected passages, remained in continuous circulation as living performance traditions. The Library of Alexandria, the great research institution founded by the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt in the 3rd century before the Common Era and the most important center of ancient scholarship, devoted a significant portion of its intellectual resources to the study and editing of the Homeric poems, producing critical editions, commentaries, and scholarly analyses that established many of the interpretive frameworks and textual conventions that have shaped the subsequent study of Homer in every period of Western scholarship. The Alexandrian scholar Aristarchus of Samothrace, who served as the head of the library in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and who produced the most influential critical edition of the Homeric poems made in antiquity, established a set of principles for editing ancient texts and identifying later editions that were genuinely foundational for the subsequent development of classical scholarship and that continue to be relevant to textual critics working on ancient texts in the present day. The Roman poet Virgil's Aeneid, composed between approximately 29 and 19 before the Common Era and left unfinished at Virgil's death, is the most important and most influential literary response to the Homeric poems produced in antiquity, drawing on both the Iliad and the Odyssey in a complex act of imitation and transformation that uses the Homeric models to construct a specifically Roman epic whose values and narrative concerns are both deeply indebted to and significantly different from those of the Greek originals. The first 6 books of the Aeneid, which follow the Trojan hero Aeneas on his voyage from the ruins of Troy to Italy, draw extensively on the Odyssey in their organization and their episodes, including a descent to the underworld that directly imitates and responds to the catabasis of Odyssey Book 11, while the last 6 books, which deal with the wars Aeneas must fight in Italy to establish the Roman state, draw primarily on the Iliad. The Aeneid's relationship to the Odyssey has been studied by scholars as one of the most consequential and most carefully constructed intertextual relationships in the history of Western literature. The Renaissance humanists, who rediscovered and promoted the study of ancient Greek literature in 15th and 16th century Italy and elsewhere in Europe, approached the Homeric poems with an enthusiasm that was simultaneously scholarly and devotional, treating them as repositories of ancient wisdom and models of literary excellence that the modern world needed to recover and understand if it was to reach its full cultural potential. The first printed edition of the complete Homeric poems was published in Florence in 1488 by Demetrius Chalcondyles, a Greek scholar who had fled to Italy following the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and who contributed to the transmission of Greek learning to the Western European humanist tradition. The publication of this edition made the Homeric texts available to a significantly wider audience than the manuscript tradition had been able to reach, and contributed to the growing enthusiasm for Greek literature that was one of the defining features of Renaissance intellectual culture. The painting tradition, inspired by the Odyssey, spans the full history of Western art, from ancient Greek vase painting, through Roman wall painting and mosaic, to the Renaissance, Baroque, and modern periods, producing works in which the poem's episodes have been interpreted through the aesthetic and cultural frameworks of successive periods in ways that reveal as much about the interpreting culture as about the original text. The Flemish painter Jan Bruegel the Elder produced a celebrated series of paintings depicting the landscape of Odysseus's voyage in the early 17th century, while the French painter Claude Lorraine created a series of large landscape paintings in the 1650s and 1660s that used episodes from the Odyssey as pretexts for meditations on light, atmosphere, and the relationship between human figures and vast natural environments that represent some of the finest landscape paintings of the 17th century. The mosaic depicting Odysseus and the Sirens, found at the ancient Roman site of Dugga in modern Tunisia, and now displayed in the Bardo National Museum in Tunis, is one of the finest surviving examples of ancient Roman mosaic art, and one of the most visually compelling ancient depictions of a Homeric episode, showing Odysseus bound to the mast of his ship, while the Sirens, depicted as women with the bodies of birds, approach from above in a composition of considerable formal elegance and narrative clarity. The mosaic dates from the 2nd century of the Common Era and demonstrates the degree to which Homeric subjects remain central to the visual culture of the Roman world more than 1,000 years after the composition of the poems, providing wealthy Roman patrons with a way of displaying their cultural education and their connection to the Greek literary tradition that was the foundation of Roman cultural identity. The ancient city of Troy, known in Greek as Ilion and in Latin as Ilium, whose 10-year siege by the Greek army provides the backstory for both the Iliad and the Odyssey, was identified by the German businessman and amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann with a mound called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, where he conducted a series of excavations beginning in 1871 that revealed a sequence of ancient cities built one on top of another across several thousand years of occupation. Schliemann's excavations were controversial from the beginning. He dug through and destroyed significant portions of the archaeological record in his haste to reach what he believed was the Homeric city, but they established the principle that the Trojan War had a historical basis and that the site of Troy could be identified and studied through archaeological investigation. Subsequent excavations by Wilhelm Dörpfeld in the 1890s and by Carl Blegen in the 1930s and 40s established a more systematic picture of the site's occupation sequence, identifying the level known as Troy the Seven as the most likely candidate for the city described in the Homeric poems. The island of Ithaca, Odysseus's home in the Ionian Sea off the western coast of Greece, has been inhabited continuously since ancient times and retains its Homeric name in modern Greek, though the identification of specific locations on the island with the places described in the poem Odysseus's Palace, the harbour where his ship lands, the Cave of the Nymphs, has been the subject of sustained, scholarly and archaeological investigation without producing definitive conclusions. A different location theory, proposing that the modern island of Lefkada, rather than the modern island of Ithaca, corresponds to the Homeric Ithaca, has been advanced by several scholars and has attracted considerable popular attention, but it has not been accepted by most specialists in the archaeology of the region, and the identification of the modern island of Ithaca with its Homeric namesake remains the dominant scholarly position. Archaeological excavations on the island have produced evidence of Bronze Age occupation, but have not identified remains that can be confidently connected to any of the specific locations described in the poem. The Odyssey's influence on the development of the adventure narrative as a literary form is so fundamental and so pervasive that it is, in many respects, the originating text of the genre, establishing the basic structural elements, the journey, the series of obstacles and challenges, the ultimate return or arrival that have characterized adventure narratives in literature, film, and other media across the entire subsequent history of Western storytelling. The specific episodes of the Odyssey, the monster that must be outwitted, the enchantress who detains the hero, the descent to the world of the dead, the return in disguise, and the recognition have been repeated, varied, and recombined in adventure narratives across every subsequent period of Western literature, and the persistence of these narrative patterns across such a wide range of cultural contexts and historical periods suggests that they respond to something deeply embedded in human storytelling instincts, rather than simply representing a set of conventions that later writers happen to find convenient to imitate. The figure of Penelope has been the subject of sustained feminist literary scholarship since the 1970s, with critics examining the poem's treatment of its central female character and the degree to which her intelligence, her agency, and her resistance to the suitors constitute a form of heroism that the poem simultaneously values and contains within the patriarchal framework of a narrative whose ultimate resolution involves the restoration of male authority over the panned household that her management has preserved. The question of whether Penelope knows that the beggar who has appeared in her household is Odysseus, whether her decision to announce the contest of the bow is a deliberate act of assistance to her husband or a genuine attempt to resolve her situation has been debated by scholars since antiquity and remains one of the most productive interpretive questions in Homeric studies, with different readers finding different answers in a text that appears to have been deliberately constructed to sustain both possibilities simultaneously. The Roman writer Ovid, whose Heroides, a collection of imaginary letters written by the heroines of Greek and Roman mythology to their absent husbands or lovers, includes a letter from Penelope to Odysseus, represents one of the earliest and most influential attempts to reimagine the Odyssey from the perspective of its female characters, giving voice to an interiority and a subjectivity that the Homeric poem acknowledges but does not fully develop, and that subsequent writers have found one of the richest sources of creative possibility in the Homeric tradition. Ovid's Penelope writes with a combination of longing, anxiety, and barely suppressed reproach that gives her a psychological complexity and an emotional directness that the Homeric Penelope, seen primarily from outside through the eyes of the poem's narrator and the other characters, does not always display, and the tradition of giving voice to the silenced or marginal characters of the Homeric poems that Ovid's Heroides inaugurated has been one of the most productive strands of literary response to Homer across the subsequent 2 1,000 years. The Odyssey's treatment of the relationship between gods and mortals reflects the specific theological framework of ancient Greek religion, in which the gods are powerful, capricious, and capable of both helping and harming the mortals who are subject to their power, but are not omnipotent and are themselves subject to the will of Zeus and to the larger framework of fate and destiny that governs both divine and human experience. The poem's opening Council of the Gods, in which Athena argues for Odysseus's release from Calypso's island while Poseidon is absent and unable to object, establishes the divine framework within which the human action of the poem will unfold, and demonstrates the degree to which Odysseus's fate is determined not simply by his own abilities and choices, but by the shifting balance of divine favor and divine opposition that surrounds him throughout his journey. The relationship between human agency and divine determination is one of the poem's central and most subtle thematic concerns. The concept of nostos, the Greek word for homecoming that gives the nostoi its title, and that is the root of the modern word nostalgia, is the organizing principle of the Odyssey's narrative and one of the most fundamental concepts in ancient Greek culture, expressing the idea that the return home after a long absence is not simply a practical achievement, but a restoration of the complete human identity that displacement and wandering have interrupted or obscured. The word nostalgia itself, which entered European languages in the 17th century as a medical term for the potentially fatal homesickness experienced by Swiss mercenaries serving far from their mountain homes, carries within it the Greek root that connects the modern experience of longing for a lost past with the ancient experience of longing for a lost home, and the connection reflects the degree to which the emotional world of the Odyssey continues to resonate with human experience across the vastly different circumstances of different periods and cultures. The Odyssey's depiction of the heroic age as a world of both splendor and violence, in which the same values, courage, generosity, cunning, pride can produce both extraordinary achievement and catastrophic destruction depending on the context in which they are exercised, reflects the complex and morally serious engagement with the heroic tradition that distinguishes the poem from a simple celebration of heroic values, and that has made it a productive text for readers and thinkers grappling with the relationship between individual excellence and social responsibility across the entire history of its reception. The suitors who consume Odysseus's household are not simply villains, but men who embody a distorted version of the heroic values. The poem celebrates their competitive pride, their physical prowess, their social ambition are all recognizable as versions of qualities the poem elsewhere admires, and their destruction by Odysseus is not simply the defeat of evil by good, but the restoration of a proper social order that their distorted exercise of recognizably heroic qualities has disrupted. The ancient practice of allegorical interpretation of the Homeric poems, which was developed by ancient philosophers and rhetoricians who were uncomfortable with the poem's depiction of the gods as immoral and capricious, and who sought to rescue them from this criticism by reading them as coded expressions of philosophical or moral truths rather than literal narrative, was applied to the Odyssey throughout antiquity in ways that established a tradition of reading the poem as a philosophical or spiritual allegory that has persisted in various forms into the modern period. The Stoic philosophers read Odysseus's journey as an allegory of the soul's progress through the temptations and obstacles of material existence toward the wisdom and self-knowledge that constitute its true home, and this allegorical reading was developed and elaborated by later Neoplatonist philosophers, including Porphyry, whose treatise on the Cave of the Nymphs in the Odyssey produced one of the most sustained and most systematic ancient allegorical readings of a Homeric passage. The tradition of reading the Odyssey as a spiritual journey rather than simply an adventure story has been a consistent strand of its reception from antiquity to the present. The Odyssey's influence on the development of European lyric poetry, through the tradition of poems addressed to absent lovers or dealing with the themes of longing, separation, and return, that the poem's central relationship between Odysseus and Penelope most completely embodies, is one of the less frequently discussed but genuinely significant dimensions of its cultural legacy, running from the Roman elegiac poets through the medieval troubadour tradition to the modern lyric. The Roman elegiac poet Propertius, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, explicitly compares his own situation as a lover separated from his beloved to the situation of Penelope waiting for Odysseus, and the comparison establishes a pattern of identification between the elegiac lover's experience and the Homeric homecoming narrative that subsequent poets in the elegiac tradition would return to repeatedly. The Penelope figure as a model of faithful waiting and the Odysseus figure as a model of restless wandering have been among the most productive archetypes in the history of love poetry. The Telemachus narrative that occupies the first 4 books of the Odyssey has been recognized by scholars as one of the earliest examples in Western literature of the coming-of-age story, the narrative of a young person's growth into adult identity and authority, and its influence on the subsequent development of this narrative form can be traced through a long tradition of stories in which the son's quest for the absent or unknown father serves as the organizing structure for a narrative of personal development and self-discovery. Telemachus begins the poem as an ineffectual young man, unable to assert authority over his own household, and ends it as a capable warrior who fights alongside his father in the climactic battle with the suitors. And his transformation across the course of the narrative, from passive observer to active participant, reflects a carefully structured arc of personal development that has been recognized by scholars as a prototype for the Bildungsroman, the novel of formation that would become one of the dominant narrative forms of European literature from the 18th century onward. The visual tradition of depicting Odysseus and the sirens in Western art has produced some of the most celebrated and most formally inventive works inspired by the poem, with artists across different periods using the episode's combination of irresistible beauty and mortal danger to explore themes of artistic temptation, the relationship between pleasure and destruction, and the conditions under which dangerous beauty can be safely encountered and survived. The pre-Raphaelite painter John William Waterhouse produced 3 celebrated paintings of the sirens between 1891 and 1900 that drew on the episode's combination of sensuous beauty and lethal danger to create images of considerable formal beauty and psychological complexity, depicting the creatures not as the bird women of ancient vase painting, but as beautiful young women reclining on rocky shores, whose appeal is rendered with enough visual conviction to make Odysseus's need to be restrained entirely comprehensible. Waterhouse's sirens have become among the most reproduced images from the Victorian engagement with classical mythology. The ancient Greek theatrical tradition engaged with the Homeric poems through the medium of tragedy, producing plays that drew on the broader mythological world of the Trojan war cycle for their subjects, while frequently departing significantly from the specific narrative and characterological treatments of the Homeric poems in ways that reflect the different values and different formal requirements of the tragic genre. Sophocles wrote an Ajax that deals with the aftermath of the competition for Achilles' armor between Ajax and Odysseus, and presents Odysseus in a more sympathetic light than might have been expected, while Euripides' Cyclops, the only surviving complete ancient satyr play, dramatizes the Polyphemus episode from the Odyssey in a comic mode that transforms the poem's adventure narrative into a vehicle for the particular combination of seriousness and buffoonery that characterize the satyr play as a genre. The ancient, tragic, and comic treatments of Homeric material demonstrate the degree to which the poems functioned as a shared cultural resource rather than a fixed and authoritative text. The Roman wall paintings discovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, include several cycles depicting scenes from the Odyssey that provide invaluable evidence about the visual tradition of Homeric illustration in the Roman period, and about the ways in which educated Roman patrons used mythological painting to display their cultural sophistication and their engagement with the Greek literary tradition. The most celebrated of these Pompeian Odyssey paintings is a series of landscape paintings discovered in a house on the Esquiline Hill in Rome, not Pompeii, in the 19th century, that depict several episodes from the poem, in a continuous landscape format that gives precedence to the natural environment over the human figures, creating images of remarkable atmospheric beauty in which the Homeric narrative is almost dissolved into the landscape that surrounds it. The paintings are now in the Vatican museums and are among the finest surviving examples of ancient Roman landscape painting. The Byzantine scholarly tradition, which preserved and transmitted the ancient Greek literary heritage through the centuries of the medieval period, when access to Greek texts was largely unavailable in Western Europe, maintained a continuous engagement with the Homeric poems through commentary, paraphrase, and the incorporation of Homeric material into Byzantine literary culture that kept the poems alive as objects of scholarly attention even during the periods when they were most inaccessible to Western readers. Byzantine scholars, including Eustathius of Thessalonica, whose enormous commentary on the Iliad and the Odyssey, produced in the 12th century of the Common Era, is one of the most extensive surviving ancient and medieval discussions of the poems, preserved and transmitted a vast quantity of ancient scholarship and interpretive tradition that would otherwise have been lost, and that has been drawn on by modern scholars seeking to understand how ancient readers and scholars responded to specific passages and episodes in the poems. The Italian poet Dante Alighieri's treatment of Odysseus, whom he calls Ulisse, using the Latin form of the name in the 26th canto of the Inferno, is one of the most celebrated and most discussed literary reimaginings of the Homeric hero in the Western tradition, presenting a version of Ulysses who, after his return to Ithaca, was unable to remain at home and eventually set out on a final unauthorized voyage beyond the limits of the known world that ended in destruction when his ship was overwhelmed by a storm sent by God. Dante's Ulysses, who delivers from the flames of hell a speech of extraordinary rhetorical power, urging his crew to follow knowledge and virtue beyond the boundaries of the familiar world, has been read by critics as simultaneously a heroic figure whose restless intellectual ambition the poem admires, and a damned soul whose transgression of the divinely appointed limits of human knowledge the poem condemns. And the ambivalence of Dante's treatment reflects a genuine complexity in his response to the Homeric hero that the simplicity of the condemnation to hell does not fully capture. The English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses, published in 1842 and written in the immediate aftermath of the death of his close friend Arthur Hallam, presents an aged Odysseus who, after his return to Ithaca, finds the domestic life of kingship insufficiently stimulating and resolves to set out on one final voyage of exploration and adventure, delivering in the poem's celebrated conclusion the famous lines about the importance of striving and seeking and not yielding that have made the poem one of the most quoted expressions of Victorian ideals of heroic endeavour and personal resilience. Tennyson's Ulysses has been read both as a genuine expression of the heroic ideal of restless striving and as an ironic portrait of a man whose inability to accept the ordinary human life he fought so hard to regain reveals a fundamental limitation in the heroic character, and the poem's ambivalence toward its protagonist. The tension between the magnificence of his rhetoric and the questionable wisdom of his choice mirrors the ambivalence of the Homeric poem itself toward its complex, morally ambiguous hero. The tradition of depicting Penelope in Western art has produced a distinctive iconography in which the faithful wife is shown at her loom, surrounded by the suitors or waiting alone, in images that have been read by art historians as expressions of the cultural values associated with female fidelity, domestic virtue, and patient endurance that different periods have projected onto the Homeric character in accordance with their own ideological frameworks about the proper roles and virtues of women. The most celebrated painted depiction of Penelope in the Western tradition is a painting by the pre-Raphaelite artist John Roddam Spencer Stanhope, produced in 1849, but the subject has attracted artists from the Renaissance through the modern period, and the comparison between different depictions of Penelope across different periods and cultural contexts provides a remarkably clear illustration of the way in which the same mythological figure can be interpreted through radically different ideological frameworks while retaining a recognizable formal identity. The influence of the Odyssey on the development of the travel narrative as a literary genre, the idea that the experience of moving through unfamiliar places and encountering unknown peoples is a source of both practical knowledge and philosophical wisdom, is one of the poem's most significant and most enduring contributions to Western literary culture, establishing a model of the journey as a form of education that has been drawn on by travel writers, explorers, and philosophers from antiquity to the present. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, whose histories combine ethnographic description of the peoples encountered by Greek travelers with a narrative of the conflict between Greece and Persia, draws on the Odyssey's model of the traveler who moves through a world of diverse peoples and customs as an observer and recorder of what he sees, and the tradition of the traveler as witness and reporter that Herodotus established has been one of the most productive literary traditions in Western culture from antiquity through the modern period. The ancient Greek concept of the hero, as it is developed and explored in the Odyssey, differs significantly from the concept of the hero as it has been understood in subsequent periods of Western culture, and the difference reflects fundamental shifts in the values and social structures that different cultures have used to organize their understanding of what makes a human life admirable and worthy of commemoration. The Homeric hero is defined primarily by excellence by the quality the Greeks called arete, which encompasses physical prowess, intelligence, social grace, and the capacity for self-assertion rather than by moral virtue in the more restricted sense that later philosophical and religious traditions have given to the concept, and Odysseus's qualification as a hero rests on his possession of these qualities of excellence rather than on any more narrowly moral standard that would exclude his deceptions, his violence, and his occasional ruthlessness from the account of his heroic character. The archaeological site at Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, excavated by Schliemann beginning in 1876 following his work at Troy, revealed a civilization of Bronze Age Greece whose material culture, its gold death masks, its weapons, its monumental architecture was sufficiently rich and impressive to suggest a real historical basis for the heroic world depicted in the Homeric poems, even though the specific relationship between the Mycenaean civilization and the world described by Homer remains a matter of scholarly debate. The famous gold mask that Schliemann identified as the Mask of Agamemnon, now displayed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, is one of the most celebrated objects recovered from the Mycenaean civilization, and one that has played a significant role in the popular imagination of the connection between the Homeric poems and historical reality, even though subsequent scholarship has established that the mask predates the period of the Trojan War by several centuries and cannot have been worn by the Homeric Agamemnon. The tradition of operatic settings of episodes from the Odyssey, which extends from Monteverdi's celebrated opera L'Incoronazione di Poppaea, which draws on Roman history, rather than the Odyssey directly, through a long tradition of Baroque and classical operas on Homeric subjects, to more recent 20th century settings, represents one of the most sustained musical engagements with the poem and its characters in the history of Western music. Monteverdi's Il Ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria, composed in 1640 and one of the earliest surviving operas, dramatizes the final books of the Odyssey, Odysseus' return to Ithaca, his reunion with Penelope, and the destruction of the suitors in a musical treatment of considerable psychological depth and formal beauty that is now recognized as one of the masterpieces of early Baroque opera. The opera's treatment of Penelope's emotional journey, her uncertainty about whether the beggar in her hall is really Odysseus, her gradual move from grief to recognition to joy, is one of the most sensitive and most musically accomplished treatments of this aspect of the poem in any artistic medium. The Odyssey's influence on the cinema has been extensive and varied, ranging from direct adaptations of the poem's narrative to films that draw on its structural and thematic elements in the telling of stories set in entirely different times and places, and the list of films that have been identified by critics, or by their own makers, as Odyssey-influenced, encompasses a remarkable range of genres, periods, and cultural context. The Coen brothers' film, O Brother, Where Art Thou?, released in 2000, is one of the most celebrated and most formally inventive cinematic engagements with the Odyssey, transposing the poem's narrative to the American Deep South of the 1930s, and maintaining a detailed structural correspondence with the poem's episodes, while creating a work of considerable originality and wit that functions entirely independently of any knowledge of its Homeric source. The film's soundtrack, which drew on the tradition of American roots music in a way that paralleled the Homeric tradition of oral performance, won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year in 2002. The scholarly debate about the composition and transmission of the Homeric poems has been transformed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by the application of computational methods to the analysis of the poems, language and style, producing statistical studies of vocabulary, meter, and formulaic usage that have supplemented and in some cases significantly revised the conclusions reached by traditional philological methods. The application of stylometric analysis to the Homeric texts has been used to address questions about the unity of authorship, the relative dating of different passages, and the relationship between the Iliad and the Odyssey that traditional scholarship had addressed through qualitative judgment about style and language. And while the computational methods have not resolved these questions, which may be inherently resistant to definitive resolution given the nature of the evidence, they have added a new dimension of quantitative rigor, discussions that had previously relied primarily on critical intuition and close reading. The Odyssey's treatment of the theme of disguise and recognition, which runs throughout the poem from Athena's repeated appearances in disguise to Odysseus's sustained performance as a beggar in the poem's final books, has been read by scholars as one of the poem's most sustained and most sophisticated explorations of the nature of identity and the conditions under which a person's true self can be known by others and acknowledged by themselves. The series of recognition scenes through which Odysseus's identity is progressively revealed to Telemachus, to Eumaeus the swineherd, to Euryclea, and finally to Penelope, is organized with considerable structural intelligence, moving from the most private and most emotionally unguarded moments of recognition to the most public and most formally significant, and the poem's management of this sequence demonstrates a narrative sophistication about the relationship between identity, knowledge, and acknowledgement that has been a productive subject for literary analysis across many different critical frameworks. The ancient Greek symposium, the formal drinking party, that was one of the central institutions of upper-class Greek social life, provided one of the primary contexts in which Homeric poetry was performed and discussed. The classical period and the practice of reciting or quoting Homer at symposia gave the poems a social function that was simultaneously educational, competitive, and pleasurable, in a way that reflects the characteristic Greek integration of intellectual and sensory pleasures that the symposium most completely embodied. The sympathetic context for Homeric performance also helps to explain the particular kinds of engagement with the poems, the competitive quotation, the interpretive debate, the philosophical allegoresis that are documented in ancient sources from Plato's dialogues to the Deipnosophistae of Athenaeus, since the symposium's combination of wine, music, and intellectual competition created conditions in which the playful and the serious modes of engagement with literary texts could coexist and mutually enrich each other. The figure of the wandering hero whose journey takes him through a series of encounters with supernatural beings, enchanted islands, and the realm of the dead before he is able to return to his home and his family is one of the most widely distributed narrative patterns in world mythology and folklore, and the comparison between the Odyssey and similar narrative patterns in traditions from ancient Mesopotamia through Celtic and Norse mythology to the folk tales of non-Western cultures has been one of the most productive areas of comparative mythology in the 20th century. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient Mesopotamian narrative that is among the oldest surviving works of literature, includes a journey to the edge of the world and a visit to an immortal figure who provides the hero with crucial knowledge about the human condition, and the structural parallels between Gilgamesh's journey and Odysseus's have been noted by scholars who have argued for either direct influence or the independent development of similar narrative patterns in response to similar human concerns about death, meaning, and the conditions of a good life. The Odyssey's influence on the modern novel extends far beyond the explicit structural parallel of Joyce's Ulysses to encompass a broader engagement with the poem's themes and narrative strategies that is visible in a wide range of 20th and 21st century fiction whose authors may or may not have consciously drawn on the Homeric model. Margaret Atwood's novel Penelopiad, published in 2005 as part of the Canongate Myth series, retells the story of the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective, giving voice to the faithful wife's experience of 20 years of waiting, and to the maids who were hanged by Odysseus at the end of the poem, in an act whose casual violence the main narrative passes over without significant comment. Atwood's reimagining of the poem, through its silenced female voices, is one of the most formally inventive and most politically engaged modern engagements with the Homeric text, and one that has been widely discussed in the context of feminist rereadings of the classical tradition. The ancient Greek concept of kleos, the fame or glory that heroes achieve through their great deeds, and that is preserved and transmitted by the poets who sing of those deeds, is one of the central values of the heroic world. Depicted in the Homeric poems, and one that gives the poems themselves a peculiar reflexive quality, since the very act of composing and performing the poems is simultaneously the commemoration of the heroes and the means by which the heroic value of kleos is realized and perpetuated. Odysseus' relationship to kleos is more complicated than that of other Homeric heroes, since his characteristic mode of action, cunning, disguise, deception is less obviously compatible with the public glory that the concept of kleos implies than the straightforward martial valor of heroes like Achilles or Ajax. And several episodes in the poem can be read as explorations of the tension between Odysseus' identity as a man of cunning and his desire to be recognized and celebrated for his achievements in the way that the heroic tradition of kleos demands. The ancient world produced several prose summaries and paraphrases of the Homeric poems that were intended to make the stories accessible to readers who did not have the education or the patience to engage with the full poetic text, and the existence of these epitomes reflects the degree to which the Homeric stories were understood as cultural property that needed to be available in accessible forms, as well as in the demanding original versions. The most significant of these ancient prose summaries for the subsequent transmission of the Homeric tradition is the work known as the Bibliotheca, attributed to a writer called Apollodorus, and probably compiled in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, which provides a comprehensive summary of Greek mythology, including the full story of the Trojan War cycle that gave medieval and Renaissance readers, without access to the original Greek texts, a systematic account of the mythological tradition on which so much of ancient literature drew. The Odyssey's depiction of the underworld in its 11th book draws on a tradition of ancient Greek beliefs about the fate of the dead that is also reflected in other ancient texts, the works and days of Hesiod, the Pindaric odes, the Platonic dialogues, but that the poem presents in a specific and distinctive form whose emphasis on the shades' lack of consciousness and their desperate hunger for blood and the warmth of life has been one of the most influential ancient descriptions of the afterlife in the history of Western culture. The Homeric underworld is not a place of reward or punishment. The distinction between the Elysian fields, reserved for a few exceptional heroes, and the undifferentiated existence of the ordinary dead in the house of Hades does not reflect moral judgment in any systematic sense, but a place of diminished existence in which the dead retain a shadowy semblance of their living identities without the warmth, consciousness, and vitality that constitute genuine life. This vision of the afterlife as a place of loss rather than fulfillment is one of the most characteristic and most discussed features of the Homeric world picture. The ancient Greek rhapsodes, the professional performers of Homeric epic, who recited the poems at festivals, competitions, and private gatherings throughout the classical period, occupied a distinctive and somewhat paradoxical position in ancient Greek culture, being simultaneously respected as the transmitters of the most important and most culturally central texts in the Greek tradition, and regarded with a degree of philosophical suspicion as mere performers who reproduced without understanding the wisdom embedded in the poems they recited. Plato's dialogue Ion, in which Socrates interrogates a rhapsode about the nature of his knowledge of Homer, and concludes that the rhapsode's ability to perform the poems with emotional power reflects divine inspiration rather than genuine understanding, represents the most sustained ancient engagement with the question of what the rhapsodes actually knew about the poems they performed, and what their relationship to the tradition of Homeric wisdom actually was. The dialogue raises questions about the relationship between performance and interpretation, between emotional response and intellectual understanding, that remain productive for thinking about the reception of literary texts in any period. The Odyssey's influence on the tradition of Western political thought has operated primarily through the figure of Odysseus as a model of the qualities required for effective political leadership, practical intelligence, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, skill in persuasion and rhetoric, and the willingness to use deception when necessary, that has been both celebrated and condemned by political theorists from antiquity to the present. Machiavelli's The Prince, the foundational text of modern political realism published in 1513, draws on a tradition of thinking about political effectiveness that has its roots in the ancient admiration for Odysseus's cunning and adaptability. And the figure of the prince, who uses all available means, including deception, to achieve his political goals, reflects a political anthropology that the Homeric Odysseus most completely embodies among the heroes of ancient literature. The contrast between the Odyssean model of political intelligence and the Achillean model of martial virtue has been one of the organizing tensions of Western political thought, from the Sophists through Machiavelli to the present. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato's ambivalent relationship with the Homeric poems, he quotes them extensively throughout his dialogues, while simultaneously arguing in the Republic that the poets should be expelled from the poets. Ideal City, because their depictions of the gods as immoral, and their appeal to the emotional rather than the rational aspects of the soul, are dangerous to the proper education of citizens, represents one of the most consequential and most discussed engagements with the Homeric tradition in the history of Western thought. Plato's critique of Homer in the Republic, which has been described by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead as the most important moment in the history of Western philosophy, raises questions about the relationship between poetry and truth, between emotional experience and rational understanding, and between the claims of literary beauty and the demands of philosophical rigor that have been at the center of Western aesthetic theory since their first formulation in Plato's text. The Odyssey, with its celebration of Odysseus's cunning intelligence rather than straightforward virtue, is particularly vulnerable to the Platonic critique. The tradition of illustrated manuscripts of the Homeric poems, which developed in the Byzantine period and continued through the Renaissance and into the age of print, produced a body of visual interpretations of the poem's episodes that reflects the changing aesthetic and cultural frameworks of different periods while maintaining a continuous engagement with the specific narrative and characterological content of the text. The earliest surviving illustrated Homer manuscript, known as the Ilias Ambrosiana and produced in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, contains approximately 250 miniature illustrations of scenes from the Iliad that provide valuable evidence about the late antique visual tradition of Homeric illustration and the specific iconographic conventions that had developed for depicting individual scenes and characters. The tradition of illustrated Homeric manuscripts that this early example represents continued through the Byzantine and Renaissance periods, eventually merging with the printed book tradition in the 16th century. The Odyssey's treatment of the theme of storytelling and the relationship between the narrator and the audience is one of its most formally sophisticated and most self-conscious features, reflecting a degree of awareness of its own status as a performed narrative and of the conventions and expectations that govern the relationship between a storyteller and the people who listen, that goes considerably beyond what might be expected from a poem of such antiquity. The embedded narratives within the poem Odysseus's first-person account of his adventures to the Phaeacians, the various stories told by other characters about their own experiences during and after the war, create a complex narrative structure in which the relationship between telling and listening, between the story and its audience, is continuously foregrounded and examined. The poet's invocation of the muse at the poem's opening, asking her to tell the story of a man of many ways, establishes from the very beginning a framework in which the poem is understood as a collaborative act between a divine source of knowledge and a human performer who shapes and transmits that knowledge to an audience. The figure of Odysseus in ancient Greek and Roman literature was so multifaceted and so capable of sustaining radically different interpretations that scholars have spoken of multiple Odysseus's in the ancient tradition: the clever hero of the Odyssey, the cynical manipulator of the tragic poets, the philosophical wanderer of the Stoic tradition, the prototype of the restless intellectual in the Platonic tradition, whose contradictions reflect not inconsistency in the tradition, but the genuine complexity and richness of a figure whose qualities could be configured in different ways to address different cultural and philosophical concerns. The range of ancient responses to Odysseus is perhaps the clearest indication of the degree to which the Homeric poems functioned not as fixed and authoritative texts whose meaning was determined once and for all by their original composition, but as living resources that successive periods and successive thinkers could draw on in accordance with their own questions and their own concerns, finding in the same characters and episodes the raw material for very different and sometimes contradictory cultural products. The Odyssey's influence on the visual art of the Renaissance was mediated primarily through Latin texts: the Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the The prose summaries of the mythological tradition, rather than through direct engagement with the Greek original, since the recovery of the Greek text and the development of the scholarly and linguistic skills needed to read it, were gradual processes that extended across the 15th and 16th centuries, and that were not complete even by the end of the Renaissance period. The paintings of Homeric subjects produced by Renaissance artists consequently reflect the Latinate tradition's transformation of the Greek originals, rather than the Greek texts themselves, and the specific choices of episode, the iconographic conventions adopted, and the interpretive frameworks applied to the material all reflect the mediation of the Roman literary tradition rather than direct engagement with Homer. The gradual recovery of direct access to the Greek texts across the Renaissance period produced a gradual shift in the visual tradition's engagement with Homeric material that is visible in the increasing sophistication and specificity of mythological painting from the 15th to the 17th centuries. The ancient Greek lyric poets who wrote in the centuries between the composition of the Homeric poems and the classical period drew extensively on the Homeric mythological tradition for their subjects, adapting and transforming the Homeric stories in ways that reflected the different values and different social contexts of the lyric tradition, and that produced some of the earliest and most significant literary reworkings of the Odyssey's characters and episodes. Pindar's odes, composed in the early 5th century before the Common Era to celebrate the victories of athletes at the Great Panhellenic Games, draw on the Homeric mythological tradition, while systematically revising the Homeric portrayal of figures like Odysseus in accordance with Pindar's own ethical commitments. His poetry consistently presents Odysseus in a negative light as a man whose cunning and deceptiveness made him unworthy of the heroic status the Homeric poems accorded him, and whose triumph over the straightforward Ajax in the competition for Achilles' armor represented a moral failure of the tradition that assigned victory to cleverness rather than to valor. The modern scholarly study of ancient Greek religion has drawn extensively on the Homeric poems as evidence for the beliefs, practices, and theological assumptions of early Greek religious life, while simultaneously recognizing the degree to which the poem's depiction of the gods and their relationship with human beings reflects the specific perspective of the epic tradition, rather than a straightforward account of actual ancient Greek religious practice. The Homeric gods, anthropomorphic, capricious, passionately involved in human affairs, subject to their own jealousies and desires, have been studied by scholars of religion as examples of a distinctive form of polytheism that differs significantly from the theological assumptions of other ancient religious prows. Traditions, and the comparison between the Homeric gods and the divine figures of other ancient traditions, has been one of the most productive areas of comparative religion in the modern scholarly period. The gods of the Odyssey in particular, with their complex web of obligations, alliances, and personal grievances that shape their interventions in Odysseus' journey, have been studied as examples of a divine economy whose logic is social and political rather than moral in any simple sense. The Odyssey's depiction of the sea as the primary environment of adventure and danger in Odysseus' journey reflects the specific geographical and cultural context of ancient Greece, a civilization of islands and coastlines whose relationship with the Mediterranean Sea was simultaneously one of dependence and anxiety, and the poem's treatment of the sea as a space of both possibility and peril has been one of its most enduring contributions to the cultural imagination of maritime experience in Western literature. The ancient Greek relationship with the sea was shaped by the practical realities of a society in which maritime trade, fishing, and naval warfare were central to economic and political life, and the sea's ambivalence in the Odyssey, the medium through which Odysseus must travel to reach home, and simultaneously the element that Poseidon uses to delay and endanger his journey, reflects this cultural ambivalence about a force that was at once necessary and threatening, a source of both sustenance and destruction that demanded respect, skill, and the favor of the gods. The ancient Greek practice of consulting oracles, particularly the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, whose pronouncements shaped individual and collective decisions across the Greek world throughout the classical period, provides a context for understanding the role of prophecy and divine foreknowledge in the Odyssey, where the prophecies of Tiresias and the interventions of Athena give Odysseus access to knowledge about the future that ordinary human beings do not possess, and that shapes his decisions in ways that are simultaneously enabling, constraining. The relationship between foreknowledge and free will that the oracle tradition raises the question of whether knowing one's fate changes it, whether the knowledge of a prophecy is itself part of the fate it describes, or whether genuine freedom of action is possible within a world shaped by divine foreknowledge, is one of the central philosophical problems of ancient Greek thought, and one that the Odyssey engages with in its specific exploration of the relationship between Odysseus's intelligence and foresight and the divine framework within which his journey unfolds. The tradition of scholarly commentary on the Homeric poems, which extends from the ancient Alexandrian scholars through the Byzantine commentators to the modern scholarly tradition, represents one of the longest and most continuous traditions of literary commentary in the history of Western culture, providing a record of how educated readers in different periods understood the poems and what questions they found most productive to ask of them. The ancient scholia, the marginal annotations preserved in medieval manuscripts of the Homeric poems that record the comments and observations of ancient scholars, provide invaluable evidence about the ancient critical tradition and about the specific passages and questions that attracted most scholarly attention in antiquity. The modern critical tradition, drawing on this ancient and medieval commentary, alongside the full range of modern scholarly methods, has produced a body of scholarship on the Homeric poems that is among the richest and most extensive in the history of literary studies. The Odyssey's treatment of the relationship between human beings and the natural world, the sea, the islands, the caves and forests that provide the settings for Odysseus's various adventures, reflects a vision of the natural world as simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, hospitable and threatening, that has been one of the poem's most enduring contributions to the cultural imagination of the natural environment in Western literature. The landscapes described in the poem Calypso's Island, with its meadows and streams and bird-filled trees, the rocky shore of the Cyclops' land, the dark entrance to the underworld at the edge of the world, are described with a vividness and a physical specificity that gives them a quality of sensory reality unusual in ancient epic, and that has made them among the most memorable and most frequently discussed natural descriptions in the Western literary tradition. The contrast between the beautiful and the terrible in the poem's natural landscapes reflects the same ambivalence about the natural world that characterizes the poem's treatment of the sea. The ancient Greek epic tradition from which the Odyssey emerged was itself the product of a long history of cultural exchange and transformation that had absorbed influences from the Near Eastern literary traditions of Mesopotamia and the Levant alongside the indigenous traditions of the Greek-speaking world, and the poem's specific combination of narrative techniques, mythological content, and cultural values reflects this complex heritage rather than a purely local or purely Greek origin. The influence of the ancient Mesopotamian tradition, mediated through the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, is visible in specific narrative motifs: the journey to the edge of the world, the encounter with divine beings, the theme of wisdom gained through suffering that appear in both the Homeric poems and in the earlier Mesopotamian texts, suggesting a process of cultural transmission and transformation through which Eastern narrative traditions were absorbed into and transformed by the developing Greek epic tradition in ways that are still being traced by scholars working in the field of comparative ancient literature. The Odyssey's influence on the development of the Western literary concept of home, not simply as a physical location, but as a complex of relationships, memories, and meanings that constitute the center of a person's identity and the goal of their deepest desires, is one of its most fundamental and most far-reaching contributions to the cultural imagination of the Western world, establishing a model of homecoming as the ultimate human achievement that has shaped literary and philosophical thinking about belonging, identity, and the meaning of place across more than 2,000 years. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard's meditation on the phenomenology of domestic space in the Poetics of Space, published in 1958, draws on a tradition of thinking about home and belonging that has its deepest literary roots in the Odyssey's sustained engagement with the experience of displacement and the desire for return, and the philosophical literature on place, belonging, and the meaning of home that has developed in the 20th and 21st centuries consistently returns to the Odyssean model of homecoming as one of its primary reference points. The reception of the Odyssey in non-Western cultures, which has developed with particular richness in the post-colonial period as writers and scholars from Africa, Asia, and the Americas have engaged with the poem as both a cultural heritage and a potentially problematic expression of a specifically Western set of values and assumptions, represents one of the most productive and most intellectually challenging dimensions of the poem's contemporary reception, and one that has significantly enriched the critical literature on the poem in the past several decades. The Nigerian writer Wole Soyinka's engagement with Greek tragedy and its relationship to African dramatic traditions, the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott's epic poem Omeros, published in 1990, which draws on the Homeric tradition to explore the history and identity of the Caribbean through a complex and sustained engagement with both the Homeric poems and their long tradition of Western reception, and the growing body of scholarship on global Homeric reception produced by scholars working outside the traditional centers of classical studies, have collectively transformed the understanding of what the Odyssey means and what it can be, made to mean in a genuinely global cultural context. The Odyssey's sustained relevance to human experience across more than 2,000 years of cultural change reflects a quality in the poem that goes beyond the specific historical and cultural context of its composition to address concerns and experiences that are genuinely universal: the experience of being far from home, the desire to return to the people and places that constitute one's deepest identity, the series of obstacles and temptations that make the journey home so much harder than it should be, and the question of whether the home one finally reaches is the same home one left, or whether the long journey has changed both the traveler and the destination beyond recognition. These concerns have been as meaningful to readers in 20th century Dublin, in 19th century England, in Renaissance Italy, and in Byzantine Constantinople as they were to the audiences of ancient Greece who first heard the poem performed, and the continuity of the poem's relevance across such vastly different cultural contexts is the most complete measure available of the depth and the truth of what the Odyssey has to say about the human condition. The poem's final lines, in which Athena intervenes to establish a peace between Odysseus and the families of the slain suitors, have been discussed by scholars as one of the most formally and thematically significant endings in the history of epic poetry, resolving the violence of the suitors' destruction not through further bloodshed, but through divine intervention and the establishment of a binding oath that closes the cycle of revenge and allows the community of Ithaca to move forward beyond the crisis that Odysseus's long absence and dramatic return have created. The ending's emphasis on restoration rather than triumph, on the establishment of peace rather than the celebration of victory, has been read as a deliberate departure from the more straightforwardly triumphant conclusions of other epic poems, and as a reflection of the Odyssey's deeper engagement with the costs and consequences of heroic action, its recognition that the violence required to restore the proper order of things leaves wounds that need healing, rather than simply celebrating the justice of the outcome. It is an ending that asks its audience to look beyond the satisfaction of the hero's triumph to the harder work of building a sustainable peace in its aftermath. The Odyssey has been in continuous circulation as a living text read, performed, translated, adapted, imitated, illustrated, set to music, filmed, and taught for more than 2,500 years. A span of continuous cultural relevance that very few human creations of any kind have achieved, and that reflects the extraordinary vitality and the extraordinary depth of a poem whose engagement with the most fundamental human concerns has never lost its power to move, instruct, and delight the readers of every subsequent period. The specific form in which we encounter the poem today, a printed text in a modern language, read in silence by an individual reader, is entirely different from the form in which it was first encountered by its original audiences. And the transformation of the poem across the long history of its transmission and reception has inevitably changed what it is and what it means in ways that cannot be entirely separated from the original creation. But the essential human concerns it addresses, the longing for home, the experience of being lost, the endurance required to keep moving toward what matters most, remain as immediate and as recognizable in the present as they have been in every period of the poem's long life. You can let all of that go now. There is nothing left to hold on to or remember. Somewhere tonight the Mediterranean is dark and still, and the islands are quiet in the water, and the stars that Odysseus navigated by are the same stars that hang above the world tonight, and the sea is deep, and the night is full of rest.